Philip, Eloise, and Daphne, worried and anxious, returned to the estate to fetch Emma and warn the others that they were leaving for the city. When they entered the house, they were greeted by an unexpected scene. Sophie sat in the center of the room with a cup of tea in hand, appearing completely calm. The other family members sat in silence, staring at her, trying to comprehend everything she had just shared. "We're going back to the city. I want to make sure Penelope is all right," Philip said sharply, ringing the bell to summon the staff and request that everything be prepared for their departure. A few minutes later, the children came downstairs. "Get ready, we're leaving," Philip told them. Hearing that they were going on a trip, the children squealed with delight, excited at the prospect. The little ones ran around happily, but Amanda, who seemed more aware than the others, quietly approached Philip. Her eyes were filled with worry, and she cautiously asked, "Will Mama be okay?" Philip froze. He wanted to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a tear slid down his cheek. He softly embraced Amanda, hoping the gesture would provide her with some comfort. When they arrived at the house, the shouts and noises had already subsided. The house was enveloped in a heavy silence, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and grief. In the living room, Michael, Oliver, and John sat, trying to distract themselves by playing with toys. Thomas and Charlotte, who had just entered the room, immediately joined them. Sophie followed, casting a questioning look at Michael, expecting news. Francesca sent Colin to rest. She probably added a few drops of a sleeping potion to his tea, so he could relax a little, Michael said calmly, though something in his tone betrayed his concern. Sophie waited for him to say something about Penelope's condition, but Michael remained silent, understanding that there wasn't much encouraging news to share at the moment. Eloise couldn't wait any longer. She left the room, determined to find Penelope and learn how she was. Walking through the corridors, she approached Colin's room. Gently opening the door, Eloise froze. Before her was a harrowing sight. Penelope lay in bed, her face pale and lifeless. The room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by her faint breathing. She was unconscious. Colin lay half reclined on a sofa beside the bed, still holding Penelope's hand, as if even in sleep he couldn't let go of her. He too was unconscious, deeply asleep, possibly from the potion Francesca had given him. Eloise slowly entered the room and sat on the other side of the bed. She looked at her old friend, and suddenly, tears began streaming down her face. Her heart ached at the thought that she might lose Penelope. Though they hadn't been close for a long time, Penelope would always be part of her childhood. Eloise realized that she had never had the chance to apologize for her mistakes, for her selfish behavior, for thinking herself superior and more important. "I was such a fool," she whispered, wiping away her tears. "Forgive me, Pen." The door quietly opened, and Philip entered, noticing Eloise sitting in tears by the bed. He walked over to her and looked at her with tenderness. "Francesca said there's still hope," he said softly, trying to comfort her. "She might wake up." "And the baby?" Eloise asked in a low voice, fearing the answer. "He's with Francesca," Philip replied with a slight smile. "It's a boy. He has red hair like his mother, and he's constantly hungry like his father." Eloise laughed through her tears, wiping her face. Philip sat down beside her and gently took her face in his hands. "She forgave you a long time ago," he said, looking into her eyes. "And she always wanted to know if you forgave her." Eloise shook her head, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Let her tell me that in person," she said stubbornly, addressing Penelope. "Do you hear, Pen? You need to wake up and say it to me in person." Meanwhile, in the living room, the other family members were doing their best to hide their worries from the children, though they weren't very successful. Anthony paced back and forth, unable to sit still. Violet, trying to distract herself, sat next to Michael and attempted to engage with the children. Charlotte and Thomas, shy of the unfamiliar woman, clung to Oliver, and Violet, noticing this, smiled gently. Amanda, sensing the tension, decided to lighten the mood. "That's our grandmother. Her name is Violet," she said, looking at her younger siblings. "But we already have a Violet," Thomas said, pointing to his cousin. "She's named after me," Violet replied with a smile. "And who am I named after?" Charlotte asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "After another great-grandmother," Sophie added, sitting down next to the girl. "And was I named after Grandpa?" Thomas asked seriously, making everyone laugh. At that moment, Francesca entered the room, carrying the newborn in her arms. All eyes immediately turned to her. She gently approached Violet, who looked at her with both excitement and anticipation. "Would you like to hold your new grandson?" Francesca asked, smiling softly. "Wow," the children exclaimed in unison. "Is that our brother? He's red-haired, just like Amanda," Charlotte giggled, examining the baby. Violet carefully took the child into her arms, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at the baby lovingly, then turned to Francesca. Has he been named yet? Not officially, Francesca replied with a smile, but they plan to name him Elliot, after Eloise. Violet nodded, her heart swelling with warmth. She looked at her grandson with tenderness, knowing how much this little miracle meant to the family, especially in such a difficult time. Night fell upon the house, wrapping it in silence and shadows. Everyone was in a state of waiting, trying to find some peace, but the anxiety still lingered in the air. Violet, rocking the baby gently, quietly conversed with Francesca. Anthony had stopped pacing the room, but his tension was still palpable. The children were asleep, but even in their sleep, they seemed to sense the adults' unease. Upstairs, in Colin and Penelope's room, the only sound was the light breathing of the sleepers. Colin, despite being asleep, still held Penelope's hand, as if afraid that if he let go, something might go wrong. Eloise sat nearby, clutching her handkerchief, her eyes still red from crying. She glanced repeatedly at Penelope, praying she would open her eyes. Philip sat by the door, silently observing, his gaze fixed on Eloise. He knew that for her, these minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. Several long hours passed. The room was dark, with only the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains, when Eloise suddenly noticed movement. She blinked, not believing her eyes, and quietly stood, stepping closer to the bed. Penelope stirred, her fingers gently squeezing Colin's hand. "Pen?" Eloise whispered, her heart beginning to race. Colin, sensing something was happening, suddenly woke up. He lifted his head and looked at his wife. Slowly, with effort, Penelope opened her eyes. She looked weak, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. They met Colin's, and for a moment, he froze. Then, with a sigh of relief, he gripped her hand tightly. "Penelope, you're here." His voice was hoarse, full of emotions he could no longer contain. Tears welled in his eyes, though he didn't let them fall. Penelope smiled weakly, her lips trembling from exhaustion. "Do I look like a mess?" she whispered faintly. "Yes, but you're my mess," Colin replied, kissing her hand. Eloise watched the scene with both relief and heartache. She felt her own tears falling again. All her internal tension and fear began to fade, and she finally allowed herself to believe that everything would be all right. Penelope, noticing her, smiled weakly. "Eloise," she whispered, "you're here." Eloise, tears streaming down her face, leaned closer to her friend. "I'm here, and I wanted to say that. I'm sorry. I was such a fool." Penelope smiled weakly once more. "I forgave you a long time ago," she answered with surprising calm. "I just hope you can forgive me." Eloise laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "Now that you've said it to me in person, I forgive you," she said, smiling at her friend. Penelope laughed softly, her voice weak but filled with warmth and love. She squeezed Eloise's hand, and all their old grievances and misunderstandings finally dissolved into the past. Philip smiled and stepped closer, standing beside Eloise. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, looking at Penelope. "Weak, but happy," she replied, her voice barely audible but filled with hope. "And our baby?" Penelope suddenly asked, her eyes widening with worry. Sensing her concern, Philip quickly replied, "He's fine. The family is looking after him. In fact, they're arguing over whose turn it is to hold him. They even made a schedule." Colin smiled through his tears, and Penelope, hearing this, laughed softly, her face lighting up with love and joy. "I want to see him," Penelope whispered, her eyes shining with tears. Eloise nodded and quickly left the room to fetch the baby. Moments later, she returned with Francesca, who was holding the newborn. Penelope gazed at her son with awe and tenderness, her heart swelling with joy and gratitude. Francesca carefully handed the baby to Penelope, and Colin helped her hold him. She cradled him gently, her eyes glowing with happiness. As Penelope held her son, the room was filled with a profound silence. Colin, sitting beside her, gazed at his wife and their newborn with overwhelming love and relief. All the hardships of the past days seemed to fade away. "His name is Elliot," Colin said quietly, glancing at Eloise. "In your honor," Penelope added. "In my honor?" Eloise asked, unable to believe her ears. "Penelope, thank you?" Colin laughed, looking at his sister with a warm smile. "If I'd known it would move you this much, we'd have named all the children Eloise," he said with a wink. "Imagine it. Eloise the elder, Eloise the middle, and Eloise the younger." Penelope, though still very weak, smiled, a familiar spark returning to her eyes. Eloise rolled her eyes but couldn't help but laugh. "Well, all right then. I'll have to send holiday cards addressed to all the Eloises and little Eloisettes of the Bridgertons." Philip, standing nearby, smirked and winked at Eloise. "Eloise Bridgerton, now that's almost a brand." Laughter filled the room, unexpectedly lifting the weight of the past days. For the first time in a long while, everyone felt a sense of ease. "Well then," Colin said, stretching with a grin, "are we done with children? Or is Penelope planning another surprise?" Penelope, tired but with a sly smile, looked at him. "Colin, if you want another child, you'll have to carry it yourself. I'm officially retiring." Colin, feigning a terrified expression, raised his hands. No, not that. I can already imagine you saying, "Colin, you understand how hard this is, right?" I wouldn't be able to handle it. Everyone burst into laughter again, and Penelope looked at her son with tenderness and said, "I think Elliot will be a perfect conclusion for us. Right, little one?" The baby responded with a loud, hungry sound, causing everyone to laugh even louder. "Looks like another Bridgerton with a healthy appetite," Francesca joked, handing over the cradle for the baby. "Definitely takes after me," Colin said proudly, hugging Penelope and their son. "But I hope his temperament is more like yours, Penelope. Otherwise, when he's a teenager, we'll be in trouble." Penelope giggled softly and, looking at Eloise, added with a smile, "If anything, you can send Eloise the first to help raise all the other Eloises." Eloise snorted, shaking her head. "Well then, send them all. It'll be fun." Laughter filled the room once more, and the Bridgerton family finally relaxed and enjoyed the moment. In the end, what mattered most wasn't the number of children or the trials they had endured, but the happy, warm moments they could share together.